Green ribbons across the bottom of their tag. So if you need any assistance, please do that. Given that you're here, it means you've worked our pass system and you've got another colorful dot on your tag today. This gives you a seat for the day in the hall. If you decide that you are leaving for some reason, please leave your badge with the registration desk out in the hall, and then someone else will be able to use it if you don't intend to stay for the whole day. The event is being webcast again today on www.carlton.ca/Africa now. And I was going to suggest at some point that we will perhaps keep the conference website going after the fact as we begin to get input from people and get feedback and look at what we can do perhaps next year in the same space. Today we'll follow more or less the same procedure as yesterday, although we moved to sort of a set panel format. Each panel will be strictly timed. You'll notice volunteers in the front row with color-coded cards telling people yellow light, green light, red light, hurry up, stop, you're done. We're doing that so that we can keep things going in a fairly brisk pace and devote as much time as possible to the question and answer session. I'd like to turn things over now to my charming co-host, Mr. Paul Hunt from CIDA, and we will proceed with the day. We have a very, very busy day, so hopefully we can make the most of it. Paul.
Thank you very much, Alan. I don't know that you realize what I'm not exactly sure how to describe this, but it's not very often that you find a senior public official and a senior media person standing side by side trying to co-host something. Usually I'm trying to dodge him and he's trying to nail me. So it's kind of heads of the diplomatic corps are urging you to put your hand in the air and show folks where you are if you're here, and if you're not, we'll get you at 1 o'clock. How many do you see? Do you see any hands? We see no hands. Excellent. There you go. Dramatic work. Well, there I still have my feet. Just capte vous êtes d'accord avec moi que nous avons un beau début hier, c'est midi à soir avec nos panels. Personnellement, j'ai été touché par la qualité des présentations et surtout les histoires des jeunes qui étaient avec nous. Hier soir, nous avons soupé avec un certain nombre de personnes qui participent avec nous et nous avons appris que pour quelques personnes, la première fois qu'ils sortent de leur pays, la première fois qu'ils ont fait l'argent, la première fois qu'ils ont voyagé au Canada, ce n'est pas nécessairement la première fois qu'ils ont vu la neige et la glace, justement, et le moins 15 et le moins 30 au début de la semaine dernière. So I really got a charge out of yesterday, and I hope that we'll keep that momentum going today. So why are we here today? Because we want to learn more about Africa, the development challenges, but also importantly the successes that are taking place on the continent. We heard a little bit about that yesterday. We know about what's going on there. I think we want to be able to meet people. That's why I'm trying to introduce our African media colleagues and make sure that you get up and talk to the panelists through the course of the day. We want you to tell your stories. We want you to listen to their stories, and we need to. Introducing the music last night. I'm telling you that there's music tonight. The Mighty Popo in the Carlton pub. Mighty Popo after the session tonight. If you're able to be there, be there. For sure, it'll be lots of fun. Good. Let me start then to introduce to you the first panel, Youth and War, the Way Back to Peace. And I'm really pleased to be able to introduce to you Madame Lucy Van Olden Barneveld, who is one of our precious local media personalities, who's often on the airwaves and talking about important issues. You may have heard her yesterday talking with some of the panels that we've had, and Lucy herself has been involved in a number of issues relative to Africa, and was recently, last summer, taught radio skills to broadcast half of them, 65 million, or under 18. We don't know how many children have been recruited by fighting forces, but we do know that the number is in the hundreds of thousands. That's a human tragedy on an unimaginable scale. And I think you'll hear from certainly our conference speaker today about his own personal experiences, and I'll ask him some questions about that. So, we've got an exciting panel. Lucy, got your gang ready? I'd like you to come up here and get us rolling, please. Ladies and gentlemen, Lucy Van Olden Barneveld and the
to speak to you. Hello, good morning. I'm Lucy Van Olden Barneveld, and thanks very much for the introduction, Paul. I'm with CBC Radio, and I'm just thrilled to be here. I spent some time in Africa 2 summers ago for about 5 weeks, and Africa is one of those places that gets into your blood system, and it stays with you. The people, the challenges, but also the hope. And I was telling the ambassador just earlier this morning, as I was giving radio skills to journalists in Kampala, Uganda, I come from northern Uganda, where all of this conflict is happening. And they were so keen to learn from a Western journalist how to cover the issues. But what was interesting to me is that I had so little to teach them in terms of what they already knew and what they actually ended up teaching me. One of the journalists, and this was a question I'll never forget, it was about midway through one of our sessions, asked a question. He said, okay, you're a practicing journalist, so what would you do in this situation? You have an important story on how government is misusing funds, and you want to tell this story, but you get a call from the government saying that if you tell it, they will kill you. So what do you do? And I just didn't know how to answer him. Amazing, amazing people. Now you all have coveted seats this morning, and I'm sure you will not be disappointed by our Grace and Sam. 2 women who were very compelling, very articulate, very smart. Well, this morning we also have some very impressive guests. Diane Mazarena, who's right next to me, Andrew Benson, Greene, and Ambassador Alan Rock, and I'll tell you all about them throughout the course of our panel this morning. We're here to talk about youth and war, the way back to peace. Now, the issue of child soldiers and how children are used and absorb it, we have to do. Some children join armed forces to escape poverty or find a new family, but overwhelmingly they are kidnapped, terrorized, raped, handed a gun, if they're lucky, or maybe just a stick, and forced to go and kill sometimes members of their own family. Now, most child soldiers are between 15 and 18, but many are 10 years old or younger. 10 years old or younger. Overcome the psychosocial traumas, but of course there aren't enough of these programs, and of course there are the larger questions of how and why children are fighting wars in the first place, and then of course the question on how and why we don't know more about what's going on. Our panel will tackle some of the issues. We'll also hear from them and then open up the floor to you for questions. So I think we can begin. We're going to start with Diane Mazarena, and Diane is a senior research fellow at the Feinstein International Famine Center at Tufts University. She is also an internationally recognized expert in gender conflict and peace building. She has taught at Harvard, spends a great deal of her time in Africa and Afghanistan, and just in the last year produced this book along with Susan McKay called Where Are the Girls?, funded by CIDA. Diane Mazzaretta, please welcome.
Thank you very much, and thanks for joining me and inviting me this morning. The work that she refers to is a comparative analysis of girls in fighting forces in Mozambique, northern Uganda, and Sierra Leone, and it was indeed funded by the Canadian government. And the work that we continue to do continues to be funded by various aspects of the Canadian government, including the IDRC and Rights and Democracy, one of your very cutting-edge human rights groups here. So I want to talk with you today about two things, and I'm really happy to take questions, I imagine, at the end of the panel. I want to talk first about why we need to think about youth. If you're thinking about war and you're thinking about conflict in Africa, why do you need to pay close attention, and so on? It's the youth. So for people to have discussions about conflict in Africa and not to really be thinking smart about youth means that you're probably not really thinking smart. The youth are also the future of Africa. And if we look at what's happening in the conflicts of Africa, we can ask very seriously, what kind of future is being created? What kind of future is being created when generations of kids are not going to school? When they have no access to health care? And I don't mean they can't get in to see a doctor. I mean, there's no doctors. There's no healthcare professionals. What kind of future is being created? The second thing is that youth are the ones who are being marginalized by their governments. Right? People are not marginal. They are made marginal. That's about power. So they are being marginalized by their governments, by states that are failing to live up to their protective obligations. It is the duty, it is the purpose of the state to protect. That's their obligations under international humanitarian law, international human rights law. Right? It is their duty under their own national laws. They are being marginalized by states where we are seeing an armed conflict, or where we have recently seen an armed conflict, where this kind of system is not functioning. Youth are also being targeted, actively targeted by their very own governments. I had a very interesting and unique opportunity this fall to meet with 34 of the leaders of 18 of the top armed opposition groups in the world today. And from Iraq to Aceh, from Colombia to Sudan and Burundi. And I learned a lot of things from them, but three very important things. The first is that all of those leaders that I met with joined the armed opposition groups to get protection from the state, right? They joined because they and their families were actively targeted by the state. And in many cases, they left torture sessions. They left detention. They were the lucky ones who survived the lottery and weren't killed. Right? They immediately sought out the armed opposition groups because they figured they're going to be killed. The state, who is obligated to protect them, is going to kill them. Right? But most importantly, what I learned is every single one of them joined as a child. They did not join for ideological reasons. They did not join because they believed in the causes of the opposition. They joined because the state was going to kill them. And they were, the children of the state are actively arming themselves to protect themselves against the state. Right? What else? So the first line of defense for youth, which is the state, is failing. It was my last option. I would never have chosen initially to go. It was my last option. So it means that the international community, the United Nations, the groups that we're working with, they are also failing to offer protection for children. And we also need to be very well that armed groups are encouraging youth to join. Of these 18 opposition groups, every single one of them said that while they understood it was against international law to recruit children, they all thought it was a good idea and they all actively did it. Right? They said, there's no other form of protection, but we tell them it's the best place for them to be. And quote unquote, why not? It was the choice they made, right? They's children joined and they're encouraging other children to join. Why do we need to think about youth when we think about war in Africa? Because youth are the fighters. They make up 50% or more of most of the armed opposition groups, the rebel forces, and the militias. And remember, people, militias are government-backed, and the majority of the people in the militias are youth. About 30% of them are girls. It's one of the things that the book talks about, just how many of these young people are girls and the differences that they encounter. They are actively joining. They are being very actively recruited at all levels, by the government, by militias, by armed opposition groups. And they are being abducted. Right? In many cases, for example, in northern Uganda, there is widespread abduction going on by the rebels. At the same time, there's a lot of recruitment going on by the government and by the militias, the government-backed militias. And what's extremely important to think about is that they are the backbone of the fighting forces. When people think about child soldiers as some sort of little side issue that they really don't need to think that much about and they'll deal with later, you got the wrong analysis. The youth soldiers in the forces are the backbone of the forces. They're the labor. Who do you think is running the camps, getting the water? The reason the wars are going on are benefiting. Why do we need to think about youth? Because youth are the ones who are being forced or who are having their labor coerced to fuel the war economies, right? And the war economies are not benefiting them. They are benefiting the elites in their own countries and elites in their... The war in Sierra Leone was about diamonds. Who's digging the diamonds? Who's moving the diamonds? Right? At the level where the resource is being abstracted, who is it? It's the youth. Who's physically was and is still digging coltan in the DRC? Who's harvesting the timber that's coming out of there? Who was physically moving the diamonds that were being exchanged for drugs and weapons all throughout West Africa? It's youth. Who are being taken captives as slaves during the war in Sudan? Who's being displaced and then used as cheap agricultural labor to underpin the economy of Sudan in the north? It's youth. Who's now going to form the militias that the new government of South Sudan is raising to go after the LRA? It's youth. Who's forming the tens of thousands they now have in the militias in northern Uganda? 80 to 85% are youth. So we've got to start seeing youth not as some sort of side issue, as some sort of, well, we'll be politically correct and we'll include youth here and there. They are absolutely at the center of what's going on. So how do we get to peace? What is the kind of a way forward? Well, I have just a few thoughts on that. The first is, we absolutely must stop talking and thinking about youth and war as if it is a side issue, as if it is not really important and can be thought about later after we've talked about the real political actors, right? It's important to locate power, and it's also important to locate how that power is being used, and that power is being used through youth. We have to stop doing this, not because it's some sort of politically correct thing to do, but because it actually gives us a clearer and much more realistic picture of what's going on, what's driving the conflict, how it's being carried out, and obviously, essentially, how to try to address it. The second thing we really have to do is we must start making much smarter regional and political analysis part of all of our work on youth, right? Very often, I can get into places that they're not letting other people get into because I say, I work with youth and children. And they say, oh, youth and children, not a problem. Head on in there, Dr. Mazarana. You know why? Because they don't think it's a political issue. And you know why that is? Because it's not being understood as a political issue, because the kinds of work and programming that's going on are not making it clear what kind of political issue it is. That's why it's considered safe. And that is a failure of agencies engaged with issues of youth. In some cases it's strategic. So, I know the ambassador is going to talk about northern Uganda, and there's a place where we really need to start thinking smarter about a regional analysis. What's going on in the north of Uganda, the situation of people is worse than Darfur. In most cases, you are talking 96% of the population. Almost everybody has been displaced. Rates of rape are higher, rates of murder are higher. We're not hearing about it. Why is that? That means that it's about politics, right? It's in need of a seriously smart regional political analysis. And we need to stop thinking about reintegration as 6-month small little programs where you can train a bunch of people to be carpenters or electricians. how can that kind of program address what we just talked about? It can't. It's a stopgap measure, right? If you want to understand what's causing the conflicts, driving conflicts, how you are central to these, that's when you actually don't think that's effective, especially for girls, right? We need to think of...
Andrew works to promote peace building among children and war-scarred youth. Peace-building efforts and internet-based innovations have won him a number of awards, and he's been recognized for that. He has a BA in English, Civil Law, and International Relations, and through the SOBE Scholars Program, he's studying at McGill. Please welcome Andrew Benson Greene.
Thank you. Distinguished panelists, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Anytime I'm called upon to talk about issues regarding children and war, I think it's an effort that is really heart-throbbing, because what I see as stories to be told for my country and Africa are really stories that are very much brilliant, that shows the radiance of Africa and its beauty and the children. But I think in an effort to raise global awareness and the predicaments faced by child soldiers, I think I must continue in this effort. Today I will be talking about my personal experiences regarding helping to reintegrate and rehabilitate children whose lives were being impaired by war. The efforts that I've been involved in over the last 5 years came as a result of the urgent need to rehabilitate children whose lives were caught up in the violence all around them. Sierra Leone's war, which lasted for almost a decade, seemed not to have been spotlighted on the international radar screen, and for almost 10 years there was little or very little effort to have a clear idea of what the war was. And so it came to a height in 1929 when the international community became aware of the atrocities meted against children. Children, on account of their special nature, their vulnerability, the fact that they can be easily brainwashed and led to fight, have been mostly used in more than the 50 wars that rage between countries today. And most of these children are used either as sex slaves, fighters, murderers, and of course, cheap labor. Today, my effort here will be not to recount all of these, but to show how, in my own personal experiences, I've been able to help in the effort to integrate them into civil society through information technology. My peace and human rights activism actually began at an early age when I was in high school. I used to face a number of excessive bullying in high school, and I thought that this excessive bullying really rejuvenated my desire to campaign against violence. And when the war raged, I was doing my college studies, and I thought that, well, I need to do something more to help these efforts to come to the glare of the international community, especially when there was little news from Sierra Leone happening. But how could this information be channeled across borders? How could we reach out to the rest of the world? And how could this happen? I began to write to the BBC, spotlighting issues that were very much questionable, issues of freedom of movement, issues of the problems faced when roads were blockaded by armed groups. But this really created a lot of problems for me, my families, and I had to flee as a refugee in Guinea for a number of years. Because of these experiences, I became part of a campaign in Guinea called the Campaign for Good Governance, Democracy and Human Rights, where I actually was creating advocacy materials for the restoration of democracy. But back in Sierra Leone, getting to brass tacks and the issues to be talked about here. Because of the problems of the war and the excessive recruitment of child soldiers, I thought that children coming back need to share their experiences of war, even though solid and bitter. How could these experiences, reach out to the rest of the world, where the stories have been very little unheard of? I thought of using technology as a means, first as a means of appeasement, and also a means to help to learn skills that could reintegrate them into the society. But unfortunately, the technology that we wanted to use wasn't there. And so I went into an all-out campaign to raise resources, technology for the young people. But reintegrating them has a number of programs and protocols involved, because these were children emerging from wars, and some of them were in displaced camps. So in my effort, I tried to do as much as possible to raise awareness on various mediums, the Fort Estate, the radio, the TV in Sierra Leone. And this campaign actually opened the eyes of the national community to understand that the child soldiers themselves were, in themselves, double victims, in the sense that these children were, as a student who I interviewed recently said, I just want to give you a quote of what he said from McGill. He actually noted that child soldering is just another form of child labor, because children are permanently taken away from their homes. They lose connections with their families, with their friends, with their regional, local, and support groups. And they lose the chance to education and having a better life. And besides, they run the risk of rape, drug abuse, violence as obvious as any soldier does. It is horribly damaging for adults to go through the process of war. For children, it's doubly worse. I'm making this statement because I think that these are the challenges that the children face after the war. When we have the chance to reintegrate them into the society, their minds have been ingrained into all-out violence. Most of them have been drugged and forced to commit atrocities against their will. The Revolutionary United Front, the RUF, which engaged the government for almost 10 to 11 years, directly targeted children as part of their efforts to enhance their rank. And because children were easy to take away, it became obvious that they were the target. But my perception is that how did the international community have to sit by and watch these events happen for almost 9 to 10 years without doing much effort until it came to a head in 1999. I think being raised, born and bred in Sierra Leone and having seen this war, I could have just wallowed in self-pity, never moving a muscle to rebuild my country. I could have just thought about survival for survival's sake and just clinging to the status quo that was there. But I thought that the essence of peace building and human rights could help a great deal to enhance the lot of these children. And so the community access centers, which I tried to have in Sierra Leone, was got as a result of much effort. As I said earlier, there were no computers, no connections. So I got in touch after a long struggle with a UK-based charity group called Computer Aid International in UK, and I gave them the credence that we could, as young people, could do something to help our communities. It was ideally a long struggle because we had to meet the challenges posed by, having access to computers sent over to Freetown and meet the protocols involving customs and regulations and getting these computers out of the queue. I talked with the ministers in charge and told them that this could help our community in a way, because if the children who have been involved in violence were taken away forcibly, they need to have rehabilitating processes that should go on so that they could have and feel a sense of the community. They could have a chance to communicate and dialogue across borders to kids who may not have experienced the same problems, but who could share in their apathy, in their woes and troubles. So I was moved to have just an open center, because the Minister of Youth and Sports said, well, we can't give you guys financial support, we can't do anything, but we'll give you an empty space and do what you want to do. And so I think the miracle should happen. So I went on all fronts with my colleagues to set this computer up through long-lasting and strong collaboration with groups here in Canada, including Watcher Canada, I Am Canada, and schools at the WHD Elementary School in Ontario. So there has been that connection. So we created the network where with first 10 workstations which were connected to the internet. In terms of having kids who haven't gone through, who have lost education for a number of years, we made sure that we had volunteer interns from colleges and religious groups to help in the psychosocial aspect and the healing process, and also techies from the universities who could come in and train these kids on a volunteer basis. And so these young people first cannot go into software application programs, so I initiated computer games as a form of appeasement, which could attract them to be part of the effort. Within the programs, they began to use the internet, and this became like a journey of hope for them, because just receiving messages of hope, of tolerance from kids across of the same age who may not have endured the same nature of violence, but have lived in a serene, country, could send in messages that help the kids to feel that they are not alone in the problem and that others do share in their grief and their agony. This was really like cathartic in a way, because it helped them to cleanse their emotions, their thoughts, the problems of war. And just knowing that a kid in Canada working on the No War Zone, which is a humanitarian program that helps to talk about humanitarian issues across borders, could say, well, look, I empathize with your problems, I feel that you are not alone and you can become my friend. These few lines were very helpful to help in the reintegration process. But the bulk of the challenges are there. Education on all fronts was very important. I think the setup, the educational setup that we had, which was an alternative school, could be merged into a normal formal school sector. So I also had a lot of campaigns to raise peace education in the local school curriculum and to involve teachers within the schools who could come in